For years now, I've been doing research throughout our collection on the women who are represented in our collection, and I decided I really wanted to focus on doing some more things in that vein. So along these lines, how I wanted to start this conversation was, we often think about the founders of Cincinnati. I want to talk about the founding women. It's a harder bit to research, but it can be done. So without ado, I am Christine Engels. I'm the archives manager at the Cincinnati Museum Center. That means I'm responsible for our records, letters of individuals, families, businesses, institutions, our own institutional records of all of the different museums, libraries, historical society, and also architectural drawings and records. So it's a lot. As I was saying, women were just as influential as men. You think of the founders or the fathers of Cincinnati, and people think of John Cleve Sims, John Filson, Benjamin Stites, Arthur St. Clair, Robert Patterson, Matthias Denman. There are equally important women, but it's harder to find them. You have to spend quite a bit of time reading letters, reading journal entries, reading minutes from various organizations, and sometimes it's reading between the lines to see if you can find something about the people. So it's a little bit more difficult, but it's something I feel very passionate about, that we can definitely find out more information, and I've only started doing it, so I hope somebody else can get inspired. Just to start, as you start with any discussion of Cincinnati history, think about why did people come here? And while it's true that some of the first people, white people here, were men, the women shortly followed. So all humans, why they chose this area is because of the Ohio River, and also the Great Miami and the Little Miami and the Licking River were all very important for commerce, and also very rich soil and a temperate environment. So there was a lot of commerce on the rivers. Cincinnati traded heavily downriver, especially as the 19th century went on with New Orleans. They were one of our biggest buyers. The South was mainly Cincinnati's biggest buyer of mostly everything. Things were shipped back east, but that's a little harder until they got steamboats. So Cincinnati's population started out, as you can see here, in 1820, only 9,600 people. And then, but the big jump really came in the 1840s. That's when there was a massive amount of both migrants, who are people coming from the East Coast of the United States, and there were also free Black migrants coming from either Virginia area or farther elsewhere. There were immigrants that came from Europe, and those 1840s, 50s, 30s, 40s is when that really started picking up. And as you see here on these numbers, it continues to go up, though it slows down once you get to around 1900. But then in the 1950s to 1960s, the first year, there's a drop of 1,000 people. And then it continues to drop. And we're right now about 287,000 people in the city of Cincinnati, which is up a little bit from where it was a few years ago. But the city was what we think of now as the basin. That was the whole city. Anything outside of that, like if you've seen signs, Green Township founded 1803, that was there, but it was a long trip to get there. So most people lived here in Cincinnati. They lived near their job. Rich people lived near poor people. It was a very intermingled city. And it was also a very crowded city. By the 1850s, it was one of the most densely populated cities in America. Roughly 37,000 people per square mile. So that's quite crowded. And along with that comes all of the problems of big cities. The city of Cincinnati was a little bit slow to have police enforcement and other things like that. They had night watchmen, but not too much else for quite some time. And as with any city, there are people who are orphaned, there are people who are widowed, people who need help, people who are sick. And mainly it was women that saw that there's something that needed to be done and decided to try to do something. So the first place that women made their mark was with their churches. Religious educational work was seen as totally fine for women. It was their domain. And so they provided food, clothing, medical care, and eventually getting into education, teaching people how to read and write, and training people for jobs ultimately. Now, what's interesting, if you look at a lot of these early charities, on all of the boards and the top things, those were all men, always men. But the women were the ones who did the day-to-day work every day. And as anybody knows, if you're the person doing the day-to-day work, you know it better than anyone else. And after a while, you start thinking about how you can do it better, how you could do more, how you could get more people involved. So women's power started to increase as people saw the good that they did, and they said, okay, yeah, of course, do healthcare, that's fine. Advocate for children, the arts, that's fine. And eventually political equality, which is a little bit dangerous for some people. But one thing I should say is, first off, who could volunteer? And mostly, not all, mostly it was upper and middle class women. And I will say something too, these photos are completely random. If there's not a name under it, I don't know who they are. And if you do, we would love to know. And I'm not saying that these are wealthy women, they just look very posh. But they were the ones who had the money, the time, and often the inclination to do it. So it's just the way it is. That being said, women have always worked outside of the home. Poor women have always worked. Lower class women have always worked. Some women have always just wanted to work outside of the house. Some women have ambition. So women have always either had to or wanted to work in different ways. And charity work became a way for women to, especially once they became more educated, they felt like they wanted to do something with that education. So some of the first ventures in charity in the city was in 1817. It's a female association of Cincinnati for the benefit of Africans. Now this was kind of a missionary sort of group. And mostly it was run by women. They taught basics of education, reading, writing, job training, that sort of thing. In the 1820s and 30s, and I should say we have a minute book from them. It's very fascinating. In the 1820s and 30s is when hospitals, widows' homes, orphanages started, places like Cincinnati Union Bethel, which served the river workers and the boatmen. Unfortunately, as we are seeing right now, epidemics hasten the need for help. And epidemics definitely hasten the need for orphanages. 1832-33 was a very severe, a rather severe cholera epidemic in Cincinnati. And because of that, many institutions were founded. One of those was the Cincinnati Orphan Asylum. It began in 1833, as I said, in the aftermath of the cholera epidemic. Members of the Female Auxiliary Bible Society saw the need for help. And if you look at some of the names of the women who started it, it's names that we all are familiar with: Rebecca Burnett, Sarah Bell Garrard, Sarah Worthington King, Mansfield, Elizabeth Hall. Very important people, as well as being connected to shakers and movers and people who could give money to start something like this in land. In 1930, they changed their name to the Children's Convalescent Home and became the Children's Convalescent Hospital in 1957. And in 1934, the St. Aloysius Orphanage started. That was started by the Sisters of Notre Dame. And that is one of the very few Catholic collections we actually have in our larger collection. Usually those would go to the Archdiocese, but the Sisters of Notre Dame, I don't know all the details, but they had a dispensation that they did not respond, they did not answer to the Archdiocese. They went ahead of that. So they were always sort of independent. So it's kind of a fascinating example to study because it was really, really run by women. Of course, there were priests and others involved. In 1844, the new orphan asylum for colored children was opened. Unfortunately, places like the Cincinnati Orphan Asylum discriminated against Black children. They also discriminated against Jewish children, which is why around this time, the Jewish hospital was established, which was the first Jewish hospital in the US. Excuse me. I'd like to use the example of Maple Knoll. something we're all familiar with now, that we know them as Maple Knoll Village. But they started in 1855 as a female guardian society and home for the friendless. I just wanted to read what they wrote as in 1855. One of the prime motives of the home was to furnish shelter for young women from the country seeking employment who were in danger through their ignorance of being enticed to questionable houses. If you read those minutes, and we have the lady managers' books where they wrote about each woman that they dealt with, what her circumstances were, what her condition was, how her child was doing. So it's very interesting because the women were doing the absolute day-to-day social work, what we would call social work now. And it's very sad too, once you get to the Civil War years, the numbers go way, way up. Lots of widowed women or women whose husbands are all fighting and they have no way of making ends meet. And then there's also quite a few women were prostitutes, or sometimes prostitutes, sometimes not a prostitute. So it's an interesting study in early Cincinnati. In 1892, they enlarged and opened a maternity ward. And eventually they merged with the widow's home and the old men's home, which was originally Bodeman's widow's home, which was one of the oldest in Cincinnati. And then in 1926 moved to Glendale, and in 77 became what we know them as today. So Maple Knoll, I think, is one of the most interesting examples of shifting. Now, there's other ones around town like Beach Acres that also have done something very similar. As I said, this is just a skimming over of things. I'm not delving too deep into anything. So here's just some pictures. I believe that's the orphan asylum pictures, the babies. On to the next one. Again, like I said, we have several hospitals to choose from in this area to talk about. I like to highlight Children's Hospital because I think it's something that we can all really relate to. In 1883, several women, especially Mrs. Robert Dayton, but also Mary Emily and Isabel Hopkins, saw the state of the hospitals, which was not good. It was scary for anybody, but it was terrifying for children. So they thought we need to do something, and so they did. And they founded, with the help of the Episcopalian bishop, the Protestant Episcopal Hospital. And then it was run ultimately by lady managers and women managers. And I always try to stick in baby pictures when I can. And so the women, in addition to running it, women did the fundraisers for all of these organizations as well. So here you see a playbill for the rescue of Princess Winsome. And these are the sort of things that women did that kept it going. A lot of these women that were doing it were wealthy and gave their own money, but even that's not enough. So they would organize all sorts of things, parties, refreshments, luncheons, teas, anything to raise money for the hospitals or whatever they were raising money for. Another very fascinating to me group that started in 1884 was called the Fresh Air Society. And in 1884, Cincinnati suffered from a massive flood, and it also had a smallpox epidemic and just the usual diseases you have just anyway. So the Fresh Air Society was founded in 1884, so it would take children and their mothers out of the city basin to a farm, and also elderly convalescent women, and just so they could recuperate and have a chance to breathe and be happy. And that stayed around till 1963, and they realized it just wasn't serving the needs of people. So that became the Cincinnati Stepping Stones, which is for children with disabilities. And ultimately they merged together, and then the Convalescent Aid Society seed money became what we know today as the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. Another way Cincinnati's women served very well, and most impressively, during the Civil War. During the Great Western Sanitary Fair, these were held all over the country to raise money during the Civil War. And in Cincinnati, it was in 1863, December 21st through January 9th, 1864. And the women did all sorts of things. They were the ones running the committee to do all of this. So what they did was they They sold food, refreshments, other donated goods. They had people auction things off. Several items which are in our manuscript collection that I wish I could show you, but I don't have them here at home. Wonderful things. But it was all staffed by women, and then the women also wrote their own newspaper called The Lady's Knapsack. It came out 3 times a week. So that's a ticket for one of the bazaars that they would show. In addition to that, the Cincinnati Red Cross, speaking of 1884, in 1884, I mentioned that flood. The flood was so bad that even Clara Barton, from the founder of the American Red Cross, came to Cincinnati to help direct relief efforts. Unfortunately, it took till 1905 and some urging from William Howard Taft to get it started. But once it did, it really took off in Cincinnati, and we became leaders in the country. By 1910, they were teaching basic hygiene classes, first aid, home care. But once World War I hit, they hit their stride. A group of 11 women organized a war relief. They collected supplies for Base Hospital 25 in France. And during their war work, they realized the need for more training, for uniforms, just basic things. So the Cincinnati chapter was the first in the US to create a school of nursing and health at UC in 1918. And then branched out to all the different things that they do. And this is, not sure exactly what all they're making. It looks like sweaters. I don't know if that's masks or what. And of course, there was also the USO, which, as you can see in this picture, this was a segregated group. The USO did discriminate, which is kind of ironic because one of their things they were proud of is that they brought two people together, Christians, Jews, everybody was working together, but they still separated. That being said, they all did wonderful work and worked out of Union Terminal too. So another thing that was really focused on at this time was creating model citizens. So the Young Women's Association in Cincinnati in 1868 was the 5th Women's Christian Association. Elizabeth Gibbon Davis was the local founder of it. And it changed in 1894. They decided they wanted to focus more on young women. So that's where we get the YWCA. The fascinating thing about them is they did in 1918, they appointed a search committee to get staff and housing for young African-American women to be the second branch of the Cincinnati YMCA. So by 1920, they completed it and had the Blue Triangle Club opened on 8th Street. And that was a very big community center for a long time. But Cincinnati's YWCA was so interesting. They were leaders in so many ways. So allow me to read. They were the first to establish Women's Employment Bureau in 1876, first to provide leadership for associated charities in 1878, which became Family Services. First to offer PE classes in 1890, basketball team for women in 1915. They also provided technical training for women during the war, World War I. And with their interracial charter in 1946, they were a leader in promoting racial equality and integrated membership. In 1978, they opened the Alice Paul House and the House of Peace in 79 for domestic violence victims. And of course, they're continuing to do quite a bit of work today. So that's a picture. We had an exhibit a few years back. So that's a painting, a portrait of the founder, Gibbon Davis. And I just threw in some of the ephemera. This is obviously through World War I era, and they're beautiful building. And this picture I just love to keep in here because you can see Union Terminal in the background. That looks like that's on the spot of the public library branch that's on Ezra Charles. Another fascinating project that the YWCA worked on was called the Women's Exchange. Women's Exchange was founded in 1883 to help women help themselves. That's their words, and I thought that sums it up perfectly. They provided employment through their consignment stores that sold handmade articles and through the restaurant that they managed for many years. They had a very famous tea room. And they were still holding meetings up through 1985. I apologize for these pictures. That's what I happen to have with me. I don't have access to all my files even. But you can sort of see in here that the storefront, so women would get experience not only in making things, but they would learn some business experience and have a chance to raise money. Clovernook. So in 1903, Clovernook Home for the Blind was open. It had only one building and the 10 female residents. And it was the first home for the blind for women in Ohio. So Georgia and Florence Trader, who you see here, or you see Florence Trader here with Helen Keller and Henry Ford II. They were the ones that started it. Georgia was blind, and Florence convinced the public library to set up the Braille reading room and Braille classes. And if you know anything about that, our public library has a wonderful Braille system. Then they convinced William Cooper Proctor of Procter & Gamble to buy the Carey House, which was the home of poets Phoebe and Alice Carey. And the work is still going on today. And Clovernook I'm very happy to partner with, we're partnering with them on our exhibits and all sorts of other things. They're an amazing place. So as you can see through all of this, from the 1800s to the present, women from all religions did everything they could to help people around them. But one is very interesting to me, and not only because I used to work at the American Jewish Archives, but the women of Reformed Judaism started as the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods in 1913. And they formed here in Cincinnati. This is now an international group. Carrie Simon was the first president. They brought delegates from most of the states, and then eventually started doing different charities and different things, but they also started the formation of the National Federation of Temple Youth, which did camps and all sorts of different things for young people, and the Jewish Braille Institute of America. They ultimately, as I said, changed their name to Women of Reformed Judaism. And this is perhaps one of my favorite pictures. It's not in our collection, but the American Jewish Archives was kind enough to loan it to us. These ladies mean business. I love it. Women get stuff done. So as you can see here, I'm trying to focus on different areas. So now on to art and beauty. You can't talk about art in Cincinnati without talking about Mariah Longworth Nichols' daughter. She was a bold, bright, and affluent woman, and perhaps one of the most powerful businesswomen of her time. She was an accomplished artist, and she started Rookwood Pottery in 1880 with help from her father, Nicholas Longworth. It was the first female-led manufacturing company in the country. And it was one of the most prestigious. If you watch Antiques Roadshow, you'll see people get very excited about it. And our art museum here in Cincinnati has wonderful exhibits, as does the town. So let's see. There's a nice picture of just showing how they worked, and I like it because the men and women are working together. It's nice, refreshing. Another name you cannot overlook in Cincinnati is Mary Emery. She was one of the most generous philanthropists of Cincinnati's history. She's native of New York, but moved to Cincinnati as a teenager and married Thomas Emery. And he built up a sizable bunch of wealth in real estate and manufacturing. And when he died, she spent the last 20 years of her life giving that money away and investing in various things. One of those things was Merrimont. I don't know of any other women elsewhere who did something quite like that. But if you do, I'd love to know. So several times in its history, the Cincinnati Zoo owed its continued operation to the intervention of philanthropic women of the city. So in 1916, citizens organized a campaign to buy the zoo from the Cincinnati Traction Company, which had owned it, because you could take the streetcar right up to the zoo. Eventually, they had to do something, and two women, Mary Emery and Anna Sinton Taft, stepped up and put $125,000 each up and asked the public to contribute another $125,000 towards the buying of the zoo. And it was such a success that they agreed to cover any deficits of the zoo for the next 5 years. They saved the zoo. And in the 1930s, Lily Ackerland Fleischman helped revive the exhibits that needed help. And then not too long after that, the Zoo Opera was established in 1920, and by the Great Depression threatened its existence. And Irene Gibson Emery and Jean Maxwell Schmidlap stepped up and secured its funds so it was allowed to continue. And there's the zoo. Another name you cannot forget in the city is Patricia Corbett. She was also born in New York, a native of New York, who moved here when she married Ralph Corbett. She was a Columbia University graduate, a trained singer, loved music and arts. By the mid-50s, her and her husband had enough of a fortune that they founded the Corbett Foundation. And I'm sure you've seen that Corbett Foundation listed on things all over the place. They funded wonderful art and music and stuff for the CCM, the opera, the School for Creative and Performing Arts, and many, many other things. Another wonderful woman of Cincinnati and a very shrewd businesswoman was Helen Steiner Rice. We're lucky to have the Helen Steiner Rice papers, as well as her books. She was a pretty fascinating businesswoman. She went into business on her own because her father died in the flu outbreak in 1918. So she put her life on hold and went to work, and she became a pretty good businesswoman. But he really, really hit her stride, unfortunately, after a tragic suicide of her husband during the Great Depression. She took a job at Gibson Art Company and then became famous ultimately for her poetry and everything, and became very famous for her hats as she walked around downtown Cincinnati.
Good luck.
She was a very shrewd businesswoman, and
you okay?
You take it quite serious.
I know. Take a deep breath. Are you warm? No? Okay.
Beyond that,
all the papers
we were concerned with community care. So in before the Cincinnati Federation of Colored Women Club started.
Do you have the paper that you're writing on that you can scan?
I'm not sure who's talking, but
good luck.
Mute, please mute. The Cincinnati Federation of Colored Women's Club started, and shortly thereafter, many other groups started. The Community Chest, which became the United Way, the Junior League, Links, and a lot of these I don't have anything to show you about because I don't have access to my collection right now. But it's just a placemaker that I will come back to this. But the Junior League, if you look at what they started here in Cincinnati in 1920, there was already other ones by 1901 around the world, around the country, sorry. But what I love is the project. Until I really started digging into them, I didn't realize just how much they had done around the city. The Baby's Milk Fund, Camp Stepping Stones, Cincinnati Art Museum volunteer and docent programs, radio reading service, Fernside. It just goes on and on and on. Now this is where I know that I have entirely too much content, but here it is. This is for another day, but the city is full of so many wonderful, wonderful women. Frances Wright is a session on her own, as is Sarah Fawcett, Jenny Porter, Virginia Coffey. Obviously, my eyes are bigger than what I can do here, but there's more to come, and that's just a Frances Wright letter. But if I could say something about Jenny Davis Porter really quick, she was fascinating because she started her own school as the Stowe School, is strictly a school for African Americans. She believed in separate schools for Black students. She felt that they would be safer and feel more comfortable learning without any threats. Some people didn't agree, but she was a pretty astounding woman. What can we say about these women? I mean, so Cincinnati has, and the scientists, you know, and doctors, Cincinnati has a wonderful amount of fascinating women. Unfortunately, we just don't know their names as well as we know the men. So it's my hope that I can inspire other people, as well as do my own research, but inspire other people and help other people in doing their research to find out more about the founding mothers of Cincinnati. Thank you. Anyone has any questions?
Christine, it sounds like you could do like 8 different episodes here. I mean, there's so many things to go into. And I would certainly look forward to seeing some of this stuff in more detail. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot that you just mentioned I didn't know about. So, I mean, that's pretty cool. I will say that you
Yeah.
mentioned Lily Ackerman Fleshman, who is Juliet Fleshman's mother. They actually went on part of the worldwide cruise with them in 31 and 32. They went on a passenger ship and met them in the South Pacific, and then stayed with them, I think, all the way up to the Suez Canal. And there were photographs of them riding camels. And Dorette Fleshman's mother it was also with him. So there are a lot of connections in Cincinnati that you mentioned, and all these names. And I think the whole thing is just fascinating.
Great. Yeah, I really want to inspire other people to really dig in. I'm anxious to get back to working with students, college, high school students.
And collections.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that was really
I'm interested in E.
fascinating.
Lucy Brown.
Oh, there's a lot about her. Yeah, she's a very popular topic right now. There's a great documentary that came out a year or two ago.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, we worked
Can you
a
post a link to that?
lot. I'd have to find that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that is.
Yeah, I don't know that I have it in front of me.
We could
But those are
probably
the
do-
two sisters and Lucy, both University of Cincinnati professors, just fascinating. Back at the time when there weren't many women professors, if any, hardly at all. And they both had illustrious careers, but one of the interesting things, if you remember from the exhibit and from that documentary, is that I believe it was Annette who was meeting a visiting researcher at the house, and because she was single, her father made them meet in the parlor for like 20 minutes, and that was it. You know, it was like a regimented sort of a meeting. It's a sign of another time.
Well, we're at our time, so if anyone doesn't have any more questions, thank you for showing up.
Thanks,
Thank
that was really interesting. Good job.
Yeah, I realized, yes, I have 8 more of these to do, so
Yeah, that was great.
thank you.
Thank
Nice to see you.
See ya.
Bye.